Our next session is entitled Freedom of Religion or Belief and Gender Equality in the Education System. Our moderator is Işık, Tüzün. For many years, we have had the chance to work together on freedom of religion or belief. We exchange information, we learn from one another. So I'm very delighted that she is going to be our moderator today. I would like to briefly introduce Işık Tüzün. She is the director of the Education Reform Initiative. She graduated from Koç University. She holds a master's degree from the International Institute of Social Studies of Erasmus University, Rotterdam. She worked on poverty and alternative developments. After working as a researcher at the History Foundation, she joined the ERG team. She mainly works on issues such as children's rights, gender equality, freedom of religion and belief. Over to you, Işık.
Thank you very much for your invitation. I would like to thank very much for this conference. I would like to thank the initiative of freedom of belief. I would like to thank you for various sessions that are complementary to each other, that are quite informative. So this reminds me of the value and importance of this conference. So I would like to thank very much all participants and speakers. I do not want to take up much of your time. I will give the floor to our speakers and then I will share my comments with you as well at the end of their speeches. Our first speaker will be Arzu Saldıray. She will be talking about the challenges experienced by Alevis in the mandatory religious culture and ethics lessons and gender. After graduating from a primary school teaching program, Arzu Saldıray obtained her graduate degree in the field of philosophy and education sciences. In her postgraduate thesis, she focused on the themes of Aristotle's ontology and archaic age philosophy and gender in educational processes. In Çukurova University, she conducted some research with university students on critical thinking as a citizenship competency. She published her work on gender in hidden curriculum, gender-based practices, and discipline approaches. She still works as an educational planner in Nevşehir Hacı Bektaş Veli University. Our second speaker will be Hazal Ocaklı. Hazal Ocaklı will be talking about freedom of religion and belief of girls within the scope of parents' right to religious education. She graduated from the Law Faculty of Istanbul Commerce University. She works as a lawyer. She has conducted various activities in the field of discrimination. Currently, she is preparing a dissertation titled Freedom of Religion and Conscience for the Religionless within the postgraduate public law program at Bahçeşehir University. In advance, I would like to thank both of our speakers. Arzu, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone from Nevşehir. Greetings to each and every one of you. First of all, I would like to thank the initiative and all those who worked for the organization of this conference. When I saw the title of this conference, I was quite excited because for 3 or 4 years now, I have been working on this research and I was looking for ways to motivate myself and to share my work with people. And I was saddened by the lack of motivation that I had. But now that I see this conference, see this title, it means a lot to me. It means a lot to be a part of this conference. So thank you very much. I conducted some quantitative study, and I would like to share its results with you. Let me share my screen with you. A classical question, a typical question. Can you see my screen? Yes, you can. Perfect. As Işık mentioned, my research focuses on the challenges experienced by Alevis in the mandatory religious culture and ethics lessons and gender. Here, I do not want to repeat the phrase mandatory religious culture and ethics lessons. I will just call it RCEL, if you'll allow me. This will save us some time. Well, there is a historical background, actually, that we need to be familiar with. Once we know the background, we can see that this issue is multi-layered. Actually, the Alevis problems with the religious culture and ethics lessons goes back to the Treaty of Lausanne, because that treaty defined some non-Muslims, but not all non-Muslims. It includes Jews and Armenians, for example, but not the Alevis, and they are exempted from these mandatory lessons. However, as I said, there are other minorities that are not cited in this treaty, for example, Syriacs or Chaldanis, and they have the right to submit some petitions and be exempted from such lessons. But Alevis are not defined as one of these minorities. So the problem goes back to that date. When we take a look at the Constitution of 1982, as you know, the Constitution was changed, and the Article 24 makes this lesson mandatory for primary and secondary educational institutions. And for the Alawi students, this causes some inequalities. In the morning sessions, this was tackled quite frequently. There is another phenomenon caused by the understanding of secularism in Turkey, because the understanding of secularism in Turkey dictates that the religious dimensions are tackled under the control of the state. So it's not in a way distributed in an equal manner, but it's in the monopoly of Sunnis. The reason why we conducted this research is that there are some international treaties which Turkey undersigned and that are binding, and they ban discrimination. And as these treaties are binding for Turkey, Turkey needs to guarantee equality. But for that, you need to collect data and detailed data, because if you do not have data, you cannot say if equality is ensured or not. This is why we observed that such research was necessary from a scientific point of view. There is also a dimension of human rights. There is also a dimension of education. As I said, this is a multi-layered problem. I would like to make a quote from Tarhanlı. Tarhanlı says that right to education is a precondition to enjoy other basic rights and freedoms. So right to education is very, very important in that sense. And there are two main components of this right. The first one is education of religion and belief, and the other one is gender equality. When we take a look at education and education of religion and belief, there are two main principles in international law. The first one is that, yes, parents are decisive in the education of their children. The first one is about parents' control, and the second one is about contradicting discrimination, about banning discrimination. This is included in the second article of this international treaty. So there are two main principles, and the state needs to fulfill certain obligations within their scope. Another important dimension, as I said, is gender equality. Banning discrimination between men and women, ensuring gender equality are important, and in that sense, We have the United Nations Convention for preventing discrimination against women, and we have the 10th article that ensures the formation of a committee for preventing discrimination against women, and it says that women are faced with a multi-dimensional form of discrimination that stem from their right to education and other concepts as well. So within the scope of this research, we look at the criticisms against mandatory lessons. There are certain dimensions. First of all, about the application of this lesson. It focuses basically on the belief of Sunnis, and the second part of criticism stems from textbooks. Because there is a sense of discrimination that we observe there that says us Muslims and the others. There are criticisms against teachers of this lesson, as they come from the Sunni belief. They apply a certain kind of discrimination, sometimes they're not even aware of. And the last component that I can mention here is Turkey's membership process to EU, because there are political criteria that are mentioned in progress reports, and there is a subtitle that's called Human Rights and Prevention of Discrimination, under which Turkey does not score very well. Here we have Alevi family examples that were faced with discrimination in 2007, for example. The families said that Turkey's actions were against the second article of the Human Rights Convention. This was related to the mandatory lessons. In 2014, there was another case. There was another lawsuit that was filed by Mansur Yalçın against Turkey, and the verdict there was in favor of the applicant once again. So the purpose of this research, here is how I can explain it. Textbooks, the content of textbooks, problems experienced by students in school. We wanted to identify all of these problems, and we wanted to explore the content of such problems, and we wanted to put forward the needs and expectations of students, of Alevi students. So we wanted to understand how this took place from the perspective of students. This is a phenomenological piece of research, as I said. We used the method of criterion sample because participants needed to volunteer to share their experiences. They needed to come from Alevi origin, and they needed to have completed their process of mandatory education. Here, I followed a two-stage collection process. First of all, in 2019, I spoke with students, and then in 2022, I spoke with 2 more students. In total, I talked to 12 students, half of them women, half of them men, and I paid special attention to their age group. This was between 19 and 24 years of age. And then there was the analysis of data. I conducted a content analysis. And as I tackled this research from a gender-sensitive point of view, gender was an important category for me for analyzing the data. So all the data I collected from men and women participants were analyzed separately. So findings, I mentioned 5 important notions before. Now I want to explain them to them. So the first concept that I would like to talk about, the first category of problems, stem from teachers' attitudes and behaviors. So I call them students here, but they're now university students. Let me call them participants. It will be more clear that way. So under the category of discrimination, they say that they are faced with hatred and enmity, and they are faced with discrimination. Subcategories, they say that teachers apply unequal treatment towards them, gender-based discrimination, alienation, discrimination that is reflected in the content, hatred, degrading. These are all the subcategories that I observed. Hatred was a title that affected me from an emotional point of view. There's a quote here that I want to voice. So the teacher invited the girl to stand up. The girl was not eager at first. She said, "I don't know." Teacher said, "I will teach you." So the girl tried to express herself in a more gentle way. "Teacher, I really don't know. I do not want to do it." But the teacher insisted. They found a headscarf and they rolled out a piece of carpet on the ground, and then the teacher asked the girl to pray, but when she said she couldn't pray, he judged him, the quote says. Another category, this is about violence. Let me voice this quote for you. In the secondary school, they taught us to pray. One teacher came to us, to Alevis, in the group, in the classroom. They said, "You infidels," because we weren't able to answer the questions. So this is another participant that expressed being subjected to violence. Another category was related to the problems that came from the content of textbooks. Here, there are certain subcategories. For example, subjects related to Alevism were not really tackled in detail. I have certain quotes about this as well, but let me skip them. As I said, this was related to the content of textbooks. Now, the third phenomenon, the problems experienced by students in school and related to social environment. So for male students, for boys, the problems that they were faced with the most was that they had to struggle to express themselves under pressure. They were subjected to violence and degradation as well. And for girls, it was rather pressure that they were exposed to. They struggled to express themselves as well, just like boys. But different from them is that girls felt incompetent because of the lack of religious formation, and they also are in conflict with the nationalists, ultra-nationalists groups, unlike boys. So they are, in a way, under nationalist pressure. So a girl who reported her experience to us, she says, so I was with friends. I was now telling everyone that I was Alevi. This is the only thing that I could do. They saw me as a religionless person. They tried to cure me in a way. They asked me if I wanted to wear a headscarf. They said they could offer me a headscarf. So another phenomenon. These are the problems experienced by students on the axis of gender. Here, girls and boys experienced similar problems, but from a gender perspective, their problems sometimes differed as well. For example, girls talk about discrimination in terms of the attitudes of teachers, but boys said that they were forced to remain silent. So girls felt nervous and afraid. This strikes me a little bit. And boys say they were alienated and they were identified very much with being Alevi. There are verbal violence, there are insults. Boys do not want to memorize prayers. Here, there are other quotes. Let me read one for you. Girls were a bit different. They remained silent. They did not show reaction. This is why religious teachers, they sometimes insisted on doing things. For example, they did not ask us to pray, but they did ask girls to pray, says one male student. Another experience, a boy being forced to remain silent. Our teacher was not open to criticism. He said, you can express your ideas, you can have different ideas, but when we expressed our ideas, he did not take it very well. That's why we received disciplinary punishments. First of all, he told us to speak our mind, but when we spoke, he punished us. He called the school principal and we were held accountable for many different wrongdoings, says a boy. Our last phenomenon is needs and expectations for religious education. Here we can see that boys and girls have different expectations. Boys, they do not support independent Alevism lessons, whereas girls do. Both groups want more equalistic and more inclusive applications. And finally, let me summarize the important points for you. You have 1 minute left, of course. Let me wrap up. Alevi students are faced with hatred and discrimination. In school, in their social environment, boys and girls are faced with pressure and they struggle to express themselves. They are alienated, they're insulted from time to time. The content of textbooks do not approach the subjects related to Alevism. And from a gender point of view, boys and girls are subjected to discrimination. Girls are afraid and they're pacifized at lessons, while boys are pushed to remain silent and they try to resist to it. Needs and expectations. Boys and girls have different approaches to needs and expectations. As I said before, girls support the idea of independent Alevism. They criticize that this mandatory lesson includes Sunni Islam practices, whereas boys do not support the idea of independent Alevism lessons. So, as a result of my research findings, I came up with certain recommendations, but I won't take up much of your time. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Teşekkürler. Hem dolu dolu bir sunum oldu hem de hani süreyi de gözettiğiniz için. Benim de böyle bazı notlarım olmuştu çalışmayı incelerken.
Thank you very much for abiding by your time, allocated time, and I have taken a few notes, and I do think that your study is quite an important one, which allows us to look at the different dimensions of the subject. And while I was looking at the quotes and reading the study, we have seen new areas where we can ask additional questions about the different aspects. I've taken a few notes. As I said, I'm not going to share all of them right now, right here. I can share them with you later on. And I might have skipped a few parts maybe while listening to you, but your latest presentation related to the recommendations of students on the mandatory RCL. Should we have an independent lesson on Alevism, or independent lesson on RCL? So have they selected out of multiple options, or have they filled in a certain blank page coming up with options themselves? That would be one question, because on the other hand, should these lessons be mandatory, optional, or selective, or elective? These are all different, have different repercussions on the religion and freedom of religion. And you've also talked about girls being made into a passive, put into a passive role, and boys treated differently. We haven't seen all of the quotes on your presentation, obviously, but I may have missed the bigger picture looking at the quotes that were presented on the presentation. I believe that was a subject that deserved a standalone presentation, a standalone study maybe. This might be made more visible. That's my conclusion from, would be my conclusion from the quotes shared, but I had a difficult time making a conclusion. And these were not in-depth interviews. These were focus group interviews, so it's not possible to go into nitty-gritty details on certain subjects, and the people interviewed aged between 14 to 24. And there's been quite a lot of changes in recent years in the curricula, in the textbook contents. So the question remains, have they followed the same textbooks in terms of the contents of those textbooks, and what was their experience regarding exception, if they have had any experiences regarding exemptions, which textbooks were used instead? Did they have different experiences in the upper level of the high school education, or in the later, in the lower period of the high school education? So I wondered about that. And another important issue worth noticing is the need for further data. Marie and other participants today have mentioned this need. So what kind of data and or research would help us shed light on this issue further, so that we are able to develop further policies and find solutions to the existing problems? So I wanted to share my notes before I give the floor to the next speaker. But thank you very much for your contributions. I'd like to give the floor now to Ms. Hazal Ocaklı. You have 20 minutes. And if that's all right by you, I'd like to type to you in the chat box to remind you that you have 5 minutes left. Thank you very much. In order not to take up too much of your time, I'd like to make a very quick introduction. I'll be talking about freedom of religion and belief of girls within the scope of parents' right to religious education. During this study, I've talked a lot about children, and I will be underlining the situation of girls, and in some points I will be looking at the legal perspective, legal aspect of this whole issue. But before I move on to that, I'd like to talk about certain responsibilities of parents in terms of raising their own children. They raise their children with their own methods and according to their own beliefs, and they have a tendency to raise their children according to their own religious beliefs, which makes sense, and especially from the viewpoint of Samawi religions, and speaking from the perspective of Turkey, which has Islam as the dominant religion, we have seen this tendency among parents, not going into nitty-gritty details, as I said, but there are a number of ayats that dictate parents to teach their children Islam and how to practice Islam. And it's not only about religion. It's only natural that parents do not want their children, they do want to protect their children in the face of facing eternal punishment because of not practicing their religion. And Alevi and parents of different beliefs do want to raise their children in their own belief system, and the parents have this expectation of their children adopting the same religious beliefs or adopting the same faith. It's not only the parents, but the community, the society that has this expectation towards children as well. And I'm going to talk about international literature as well, because this expectation is also adopted by the international community, by lawmakers as well. And we can say that there's been progress observed across the world. Children's rights are being upheld more and more, but still, children are still viewed as part and parcel of their parents. First and foremost, in the scope of parents' rights, right to religious education of their children, we have to refer to the Article 9 of the Universal Code on Human Rights, which regulates freedom of religion and faith, and Protocol number 1 guarantees right to an education. And while regulating right to an education, parents are allowed to raise their children in line with their own religious beliefs and faiths, and this is in a way a right accorded to the parents. And the Article 5 of the Declaration is regulated under children's rights, but when we look into the contents of this article, it really talks about parents' rights, not children's rights, because it regulates the ethics, so on and so forth, and it talks about the children being trained according to the religion and or faith of their parents. And if the child has no parents, they have to look at the signs. One has to look at the signs and certain indications around the child to determine to which religion the child will belong. So the child will only be listened to if the child does not have any parents. So that's one way of interpreting it. And the Convention banning discrimination stipulates that parents' rights to religious education of their children should be respected. And it also emphasizes that nobody should be forced to receive any religious education, but we have no concrete regulation on this matter. So looking at one article, no person should be forced into religious education that does not comply with their own religious or faith group, etc. But child per se is not defined here. Looking at the national laws, we have to talk first and foremost about the Article 24 of the Constitution, which stipulates that the religious education will be handled by the state, which brings us to mandatory religious culture and ethics lessons, and the child's choice and parents of the child's choice is underlined. And according to the Civil Code of Turkey, again, parents are entitled to decide on the religious education of the child, and the people or persons over the age of 18 who are adults have the right to choose their own religion. In other words, children do not have any choice in religion or faith. Article 9 of the Convention on Human Rights is prevalent here as well. So this right is not peculiar to adults only, but we have the United Nations Convention on Child's Rights, Article 14, which is quite similar to the Article 9 of the Human Rights Convention. From the following perspective, there's a long explanation about the religion, including practicing of religion, etc., etc. It does not give that detail. It only says that the article on the Convention on the Rights of the Child just talks about respecting the children's choices. During the negotiations for the convention, there was a reservation placed on this article by those states that have an official religion of state. So there's a generic statement that freedom of religion must be respected. It might be considered to cover a lot of things, but during the negotiations on this particular article, a number of opinions were expressed, and looking at the general application of the international conventions, we can say that I am of the opinion that it is not taken so seriously, I'd say, and Tolga Şirin has made a very important statement about it. The child is protected against the indoctrination of the state, and we see this quite often. We see it in decisions. We're familiar with it, but when it comes to the indoctrination of parents, we have no protection mechanism for children. And the following view is also put forward. Children are not full adults. They are deprived of the skills to make the right decision for themselves. This might be accepted as such until a certain age. We cannot directly say that a child up until a certain age is deprived of the skills to take their own decisions, but we cannot assume that children suddenly and magically turn into adults after the age of 18. But we're talking about enhancing capacity of a child during puberty. This has been referred to quite often, but there's no concrete translation of it, if you like. We have seen the discussion on the religious age of consent of quite often, as I see, children being able to exempt themselves from the mandatory RCL, children being entitled to changing their religion, converting to another religion. I'd like to present to you an example from the Turkish Penal Code, Turkish Penal Law. Children from age 0 to 13 have no legal responsibility over that age. They do have that responsibility. And there's this following distinction. If the child is capable of understanding the consequences of their actions, then they have the criminal capacity. So if a 13-year-old child can commit a crime and has criminal capacity, yet has no say in their religion, and all the say about their choice of religion belongs to their parents, does not make sense. It's not just. There are a number of examples that I'm not going to give you about these age groups, but let me say, refer to a study conducted by the Fundamental Rights Agency of the European Union. In some countries, 13, 15, 16-year-olds are given the right to convert to another religion or change their religion. Even if it's not very common, in some European countries, children can make the decision to be exempt from the mandatory religion lessons. And I'd like to give you another example and go into the conflict area a little bit. we're talking about parents disseminating the religion to their children, and this is an external right. But there are, unfortunately, a lot of intensive interventions in the internal rights and choices of the child. I believe that the children's rights should be upheld in most instances here, but unfortunately, looking at what we see in practice, parents' rights are upheld rather than the children's, but we can say that there is a positive progress across the world about protecting children's rights and choices, but from the viewpoint of the situation in Turkey, I am not that optimistic, because especially from the gender perspective, we have started to see more and more patriarchal structure in the country. I'm not talking about long term, but very recently we've seen an example, Turkey's withdrawal from the Istanbul Convention, and in that phenomenon, religious communities have played a great role. Religious communities were discussing this issue quite a lot previously, and after the withdrawal of Turkey from the Istanbul Convention, we've again heard from a lot of religious communities that this was the right move, and we've seen similar lines from the politicians, and on their website, some of the websites, we've seen statements such as women's primary role was motherhood, and women mothers before all. And these statements are available online still. And looking at the girls in Turkey, girls have to fight against these gender roles on the one hand, and on the other hand, if they happen to have a conflict with the religious beliefs of their parents and their own, they have to go into conflict with their parents as well. And these are negatively complementing phenomena, if you like. And from an education point of view, here's what we see. Girls are raised more conservatively, generally speaking, and education is a gateway to the outer world for most girls. And if the girls happen to have a differing opinion or belief than their parents, education is perceived more negatively by the parents, because it is a factor that helps the child to change, or education is used as a form of rehabilitation, because they put the girls to religious education, sending the girl to religious education facilities, trying to fit the girls into a closed box, if you like. And we can talk about three fundamental phenomena in Turkey. We have prayer schools. First of all, greatest violations and most intensive religious education is delivered in those schools. First of all, from the point of view of the students attending these schools, we have imam preacher schools. We have the children younger than 11 years old can attend these schools, and this is not my area, but children can start developing capacities to think in a non-concrete manner is at year 11, year 12, and we cannot state that it is a reliable decision or the decision of the child to attend these schools before that age, because this is obviously a decision taken by the parents, which has a tremendous impact on the lives of the children. And I'm looking at the chat box at the same time. I'm so sorry. And you'll remember regarding imam and preacher schools, these students were once very high on the agenda. It was a terrible headline. Headlines were going like, our nation will give no credit to such perverts and pervert views. And imagine the kind of pressure put on the children, and imagine the kind of pressure parents would put on their children seeing those headlines. And looking at the textbooks in imam and preacher schools, and there is a textbook called Fıkıh Readings, which is available online on the Ministry of National Education resources. There's a page on the textbook that says that abortion is murder. And in a follow-up, the textbook talks about those women who fall pregnant because of extramarital affairs and do not want to go down in life. They can use abortion. Even many years after the abortion, they suffer from tremendous trauma, it says. And the same textbook also talks about rights and responsibilities of family members. In that section of the textbook, the text talks about the rights of men over women and women's rights over men. And there's also a statement that goes like, men have more rights over women than women over men. And these children are sent off to these schools starting at the age of 10, consuming these textbook contents. And they can go into conflict with their peers and their teachers, as well as with their parents. I've talked about the mandatory RCL as well during my study. There are far more details in the study as well, but I'm not going into those details. It's the RCL starts as of the year fourth grade, and exemptions only apply to Jewish and Christian students. Even if exemption is available to other children, it's quite problematic, even if there's no conflict between parents and the children. And looking at the exemption procedure, the child plays no role at all. The child alone cannot do anything. And this can lead to a lot of different problems according to different possibilities, according to different scenarios. And the most striking example would be the following. If the child is not a Sunni Muslim and does not want to take this mandatory RCL, but the parents do want the child to take this mandatory RCL, or the parents do simply not want to get into this procedure of exemption, the child has to be exposed to this RCL, mandatory RCL, and there are some elective, so-called elective courses, which are practically mandatory and have to do with religion, and the final say lies with parents and not really with the child. And I'm going to talk about Holy Quran courses, and I've talked about the Article 24 of the Constitution, third paragraph, non-mandatory religious education, which is dependent on the request of the minors and their parents. It's not a legal requirement. Age of 10 is quite early because of the abstract thinking capabilities, but for the Holy Quran courses, there's no lower limit of age. There previously was one, but practically today, any child of any age can be sent off to these Holy Quran courses. And under normal circumstances, these courses and dormitories cannot be set up or provided outside of the control of the Presidency of Religious Affairs, but we know that in practice, in real life, most of these courses and dormitories are operated and set up by religious communities, and there are so many examples of psychological, physical, and sexual abuse cases, and children are made into a vulnerable position in those places. And when parents send their children off to these places and the children find themselves with no support from their parents, they find themselves alone, having to cope alone. And from the viewpoint of girls, Holy Quran courses and dormitories are considered to be more of a priority than regular education, because they want to be kept in a closed box and with a minimum to no interaction with the opposite sex. So Holy Quran courses and dormitories are considered to be more reliable, more healthy from that point of view. And to wrap up, looking at international and national regulations, the statements are very abstract, and there's little to no national regulations in place, and children are practically not protected at all, and the age limit should not be dropped further. It should be dropped for the choice of religion, and primarily through international and then through national regulations, children should be protected in this field. Thank you very much.
Çok teşekkürler. Emeğinize sağlık. Yani konunun gerçekten çok göz ardı edilen boyutuna dair bir çalışma, çok da
Thank you
etraflı.
very much. Thank you for your efforts. There are issues that are ignored within the scope of this subject, so you tackled all of them. Thank you very much for that. I have taken a few notes. I would like to share those with you. I work in similar fields, therefore I would like to share them with you. First of all, you already talked about the increasing capacities. It is included in your declaration. You also cited it because these increased capacities are a must in these studies. There is another important factor for such studies. It's one of the umbrella rights under Children's Rights Conventions, and this is the right to participation. We frequently cite it. It is guaranteed under this convention. The right to participation, it is underlined, and some basic principles are put forward. It also gives us clues about how implementation should be, because this is quite a complicated field. I just wanted to mention it. You also mentioned that children's freedom of religion and parents' religions, they should be tackled sometimes separately. It is a critical issue because they could be different from each other. There was quite a rich content there because this issue requires a lot of multi-layered thinking. The Special Rapporteur of Freedom of Belief of the UN especially tackles this issue. Therefore, it is an important issue, and the current studies can form a basis for us to elaborate it. There are various dimensions, as you said, but the issue keeps getting more and more complicated. 10 years ago, 12 years ago, we only talked about mandatory lessons and schools, but now we have courses, dormitories, elected courses. There are different dimensions now. There are mandatory lessons, and on top of that, we have religion lessons integrated into other courses as well. I just wanted to repeat that this is an area that is difficult to monitor. Different associations and foundations cooperate with the Ministry of National Education, and this is under the umbrella of values education, and these studies under the scope of values education can sometimes integrate religious education as well. I just wanted to repeat it. You also speak separately about the experience of girls, but a separate gender-sensitive part in the end could be good in terms of summarizing the issue and providing a general evaluation. So I will stop here to share the questions with you. First of all, Arzu, I have two questions for you. A question from Kudret Nezir Yunusoğlu. He thanks you. By the way, there are many people who thank you. There are many people who share their experiences and opinions. Thank you very much. Do you have any suggestion of campaigns or methods or ideas that we can conduct against mandatory lessons? Another question from Zehra Hanım. Were there people who filed formal complaints about such discriminatory practices? among the people that you interviewed? Okay, thank you very much. Honestly, I wasn't able to follow all the questions in the chat box during my presentation, so please excuse me for that. But I would like to thank all of you who asked questions for your attention. Now, about the campaigns on mandatory lessons, I did not specifically conduct research on that, but I scanned the work carried out before me, and I saw that such studies were conducted by Alevi civil society organizations. I personally interviewed the civil society organization. We wanted to carry a common study together, but they were based in, they were based in Germany, and we wanted to enjoy their experiences in going against mandatory lessons in Germany. But we were not able to conduct common studies in the end, honestly. As I said, such campaigns are mostly conducted through civil society organizations, or there are individual lawsuits such as Eylem Zengin or Mansur. As I mentioned, there are cases that are brought before the European Court of Human Rights. Mansur Yalçın was the name. I wasn't quite sure of the name. Let me say it clearly. Okay, thank you very much. Now, the second question. There was no student that had filed campaigns among my interviewees. One of them, I didn't read the quote, but one of them told me that she and her boyfriend had gone to the school principal, told him that their parents were Christians, so they did not want to attend these lessons. Actually, it was her boyfriend who had done it, and she wanted to do the same thing, but her parents were not actually Christian, but she wanted to using this method in order to avoid such lessons. But unfortunately, there was no active law cases like that filed by my interviewees. Thank you very much, Arzu. I am checking the chat box once again. I have checked the Q&A part as well. There was no question for Hazal, but I have a question, and then we are going to have to wrap up this session. You are also a lawyer, Hazal. And we were talking about seeking our rights, demanding our rights. But in a field of religion and education, people can have certain reservations because their children continue to go to such schools and they don't want to be seen in a certain way. So sometimes the methods of demanding rights can be quite complicated. So ways of seeking rights, child-friendly methods, because you know the legislation in Turkey. What kind of methods, what kind of paths can be taken to seek and demand rights? What do you say? Are you asking this question specifically for mandatory lessons or in general? It could be freedom of religion and gender as well, but more specifically about the mandatory lessons. Okay. Let me specifically talk about the lessons. The lawyer Özge Demir has a book specifically on this, about being exempt from the mandatory religious lessons. And she is actively pursuing such cases as a lawyer. Unfortunately, children cannot do much by themselves. Parents can do certain things. They can go to the school administration, for example, and then they can go to the Ministry of National Education. If their demands are rejected, then they can go to the Court of Appeals. They can use legal ways. They can go to the Council of State to file complaints, but these systems are quite lengthy. We are talking about the state of councils. These are administrative cases, and in the end, when the state of council, when the Council of State makes a decision, children are no longer in school. They are university students. And here is the problem. This steps beyond the sphere of law, actually. Because when children are exempted from mandatory lessons, there is no alternative for them. If they do not go to such courses, they have to wait outside. It's not safe, and it is problematic in terms of discrimination, because other children in school, they also know that these specific friends do not follow the same courses, etc. So this is not about changing the legislation. It's about making certain changes in the educational system, especially about religious lessons. These should be changed to the form of a general religious lesson, or without specifically focusing on Sunnism, or they should be made 100% elected courses. As you say, even though we have the necessary legislation, if we do not come up with the necessary alternatives, it's useless. And the exemption system, we also should say that if you want to be exempted, you need to explain the reason why, which is not always convenient. Thank you very much. You did not have much time, I know. I had to harass you with my little messages on the chat box so that you wrap up on time. But thank you very much for this presentation. Thank you very much, our moderator and our panelists. We are now going to have a 5-minute break, and then we are going to continue with our next session. Our next session will be on experiences at the intersection of freedom of belief and gender. Thank you very much. See you in our next session.